summarizing some bits. I'm sorry, I'm hoping that doesn't lose the thread of the argument overall. The purpose of this talk is to demonstrate that the mechanisms of power around classifications of gender and sexuality are not always top-down or bottom-up. Instead, the weight of social disapprobation among members of sexual subcultures themselves help to create these classifications, often reflecting the nomenclature of subjects and desires within sexual subcultures in a complex relationship to the dominant culture. Examining two benchmarks in the development of sexual nomenclature within queer subcultures, this paper finds its evidence in George Chauncey's little-known analysis of a Navy investigation of male homosexuality at the Newport Naval Training Station during the World War I era. That part has been cut out of this talk. And in contemporary folksonomic classifications of representations of queer desire within X2, a database of online pornography. Each case reveals a complex social and cultural structure among members of sexual subcultures by drawing our attention to the particularity of various modes of sexual being and the relationship between those modes and particular configurations of sexual identity. In the process, this talk allows us to reassess two things. First, a presupposition of folksonomies as free of discipline, allowing for their emancipatory potential. And second, the prevailing binary understanding of authority in the development of sexual nomenclatures and classifications as either top-down or bottom-up. And so I'll just summarize that there's a large body of research that talks about the development and it implies that the power mechanisms surrounding this nomenclature either happens in a top-down fashion, it's developed by an institution or someone in a position of authority, or it's a folksonomy. And the idea is that the folksonomy is supposed to supplement or augment or even counteract the hegemonic force. And this isn't to say that folksonomies don't do that, and they can't displace the absolute authority of an institution. It's simply to refine that understanding of how power operates. I guess I'm implying that it's a vertical as well as horizontal power dynamic. And some of this comes through in the way in which the folksonomies are socially dynamic and socially developed. So I'm just going to quickly skip to the horizontal discipline that I'm talking about. And this comes from Chauncey. There's basically two major points I want to take away from him before we move on to X2. Members of the subculture that Chauncey examined, and he basically looked at archival evidence of this Navy investigation that mapped a particular subculture in Newport during World War I, and it showed actually that Foucault's major thesis actually has to be dramatically refined, and it showed that obviously the social organization of sexuality and gender then is completely different than it is now, even different than it had been in years prior. And we can talk more about that if you'd like. But here are the major points I want you to take away from Chauncey. Members of the subculture that he looked at themselves heavily regulated each other's exploration. The weight of a dominant culture's disapproval led people within the subculture to insist on a form of solidarity that required conformity to its own standards. To be accepted by the subculture, one had to assume the role, and these are some of the old nomenclature, and I can explain what they mean if it doesn't come through. One had to assume the role of a pogue, a fairy, a two-way artist, or a husband, and to present oneself publicly in a manner consistent with that labeling. Chauncey reveals that the behaviors of members of the subculture who tried to explore outside the boundaries of their category were seen as inappropriate, as in the case when a fairy tried to brown another member of the subculture, which was incongruent with the fairy's role as a queer. When members of the subculture not only disapproved of non-conforming exploration, some of them also believed they could identify men as pogues or fairies, even if the men had not recognized themselves as such. Now, Chauncey shows that these men sometimes intervene to accelerate the process of self-discovery. So the subculture scrutinized newly arrived recruits, for example, at the YMCA for likely sexual partners and queers, and at least one case is recorded in their approaching an effeminate but straight identified man named Rogers in order to bring him out as a pogue. While he recalled always having been somewhat effeminate after he joined the subculture, Rogers began using makeup because others did, assumed the name Kitty Gordon, and developed a steady relationship with another man, his husband. Such were the regulatory strictures among members of the subculture themselves. They felt that not only could they intervene into the destinies of their fellow members, but also that they could precisely identify people's true natures. Hence, social organization, self-understanding, and categories of identity developed under the weight of social disapprobation between members within a subculture and always in relation to a dominant culture. Now, two aspects of this resonate with X2. Obviously, it doesn't map on directly, and we can talk about the ways in which it's different. But here are the two ways in which Chauncey's thesis resonates. First, tagging within X2 reveals highly developed and very queer social organization and nomenclature. And second, the tags develop under the weight of social disapprobation among members of the subculture themselves, always in relation to a dominant culture. Tagging practices within X2 and similar sites serve as a benchmark in studying the development of sexual nomenclatures because they reveal how members of the subculture view themselves, how they view others, and how members of the larger community view them. With more than 9 million members, X2 claims to be the first adult website to allow members to upload their homemade photos and videos. It's effectively YouTube for pornography, but with far more social networking design elements, including live camera exhibitionism between members, a dating portal, a wiki, blogs, group forums, quizzes, and polls, to name a few. It also allows members to view each other's profiles, to follow a particular member's images and videos, and to follow which image and videos a particular member likes. Because pornography is representational, it enables us to study societal gender and sexuality. Pornography is, according to Laura Kipnis, intensely and relentlessly about us. It involves the roots of our culture and the deepest corners of the self. As such, the tagging that surrounds pornography enables us to study societal gender and sexual nomenclature and social organization. Now, in a previous essay, I've shown that X2 attempts to provide a near instantaneous mass mediation and dissemination of sexual representation. One might argue that this wealth of images offers an emancipatory scenario in which subjects can project their virtual selves into a seemingly endless variety of environments and to embody an infinite number of freely chosen subject positions, roles, and desires. In doing so, we may think X2 allows for an exploration of the self and one's identity in relation to others, indeed relying on others as viewers, or, in other words, an exploration of various stylistics of the self in the form of aesthetics, not aesthetics. Yet in my analysis of the eroticization of hierarchical knowledge structures, I find that X2's classification actually functions to guide, if not overtly discipline subjects, both the subject of the images and the viewer as subject. It is evidence of an environment in which desires and subject positions are produced as essential standards through a discourse of hierarchical categorization and classification. Images on X2 are available to the viewer only through the negotiation of a coarse and elaborate typology in which subject positions are fixed and defined in relation to each other. Some of these categories, that's X2's home language, are authoritative or prescriptive, developed by X2's administrators. X2 requires viewers to select between 1 and 3 categories from among more than 30 prescriptive categories to describe an image or video when uploading it to the site. And I'm just going to give you the most unoffensive example that I can find. X2 requires that members choose whether the video is gay or straight, and whether the subject of the video is a single man, single woman, man and man, men and women, and transsexuals. These are their terms. These are members' only choices, and they probably say more about X2's administrators than they do about a dominant culture. Members can also add a title, description, and tags, which X2 doesn't predetermine. As a result of these various categorical configurations, members can perform faceted searches that mix and match any of the various categories and tags. Members can search multiple categories and tags or a single category or tag simultaneously, all of which has been hyperlinked. Keyword searches include titles and descriptions that haven't been hyperlinked. A member's exploration within X2 is always already constrained by a logic of recognizable cues that are regularized, disciplined, and stabilized according to received forms of sex and desire. Tagging always occurs in relation to X2's prescriptive categories. As such, members' gender and sexual organization is always named, regulated, and stabilized in advance along a coarse axis of registers. Because the identity of one's gender and sexual being belongs within discernible boundaries, one might perceive that gender and sexuality are stable, regardless of whether one's feelings transgress these boundaries. However constrained by X2's prescriptive categories, it is in tagging that members have some opportunity to role-play within this scene of constraint. And we can talk about what I mean by that. It's a phrase from Butler. As one might imagine, the tags reveal a highly developed and varied nomenclature and social organization. Yet, this nomenclature is not necessarily particularistic or idiosyncratic. It is regulated by the social conventions of language and ideology. As such, members develop these default taxonomies in fundamentally communal ways. Indeed, it is important to bear in mind that the purpose of these tags is to name and structure one's gender and sexual being within a broader social network. The practice of tagging one's homemade images and videos primarily occurs so that members enable others to access their representations, usually for the purpose of sexual arousal. In this way, members' perception, nomenclature, and identity of their own gender and sexuality are intimately tied to each other. That is, the power to tag offers queer individuals a means for describing and structuring feelings of difference into coherent identities and particular social forms, and to relate those forms and identities to the way other people view them, to the way they view other people, and to the way other people view themselves, collapsing the distinction between exhibitionist and voyeur. Participating within this social network also means that members of X2 regulate each other's tags and therefore social organization. Tagging patterns stabilize over time as the numbers of members increase. There are a number of studies to show that. While this serves the strictly practical purpose of effective image and video retrieval, it also functions to stabilize the nomenclature used by members to structure their own gender and sexuality in order to participate in X2's social relations. Members necessarily have to tag their images and videos in a way that allows for its retrieval by other members. To rely on a purely idiosyncratic and particularistic nomenclature is to remove oneself from these social relations. Hence, members structure their own gender and sexuality in a way that is accessible for others and allows for social engagement. In this way, a form of horizontal discipline occurs through the stabilization of these categories. Social relations within X2 require a common nomenclature that is regularized over time. Now, this isn't to say that nomenclature doesn't change over time, but that such a change occurs communally. And we can talk more about these communal developments. Thus, however free one is to role play within these categories, members necessarily structure their feelings of difference and self-understanding into stable, coherent, and discernible social forms. Most of the overt intervention into each other's self-understanding is the overt intervention into each other's self-understanding and nomenclature occurs within the discussion section of X2's wiki. But such intervention also occurs within the comment sections of images and videos. In one instance, when a member tagged his video boy, B-O-I, several members debated the meaning of the term. Some members understood the term to mean, as Judith Butler does, a boyish gay man. X2's wiki page defines it as an effeminate, submissive gay boy who wishes to distinguish himself from heterosexual boys, but who attempts to be alluring and seductive. It's a rather lengthy definition and very precise. Others insisted that the term refers to female, male, transgender people. Still others felt it was any submissive man who preferred the receptive role in sex. Such is the need for members to control the meaning of this nebulous category. Overt intervention within queer subcultures especially seems to occur within fetishistic subcultures that are subsumed under a broader queer subculture, such as BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism. Its websites serving the BDSM community include Colony.com, BDSM.com, Recon.com, and so on. And Recon claims to be the world's largest hookup site for men into fetish gear. Within the subcultures that these sites serve, one's identity as dominant or submissive is profoundly important to the social relations within that community. Members of these groups find sexual pleasure in the way these categories are explicitly stable, autonomous, hierarchical, antithetical, and even, yes, essential. These categories not only indicate social organization and self-understanding, members also sometimes express them as constitutive of one's destiny and true nature. Because these categories so profoundly define the subculture and the people within it, members of this subculture have a high level of investment in debating the boundaries and meanings of these categories. Tagging on X2 draws our attention to a complex social and cultural structure of particular and various modes of sexual being and the relationship between those modes and particular configurations of sexual identity. X2's algorithm allows us to search keywords that not only retrieve images and videos tagged with that word, but also indicates on the right-hand side of the screen all of the tags that relate to that word. The algorithm calculates relativity based on how often different tags appear together when members tag their images and videos. X2 calls these tags related tags. And here's, again, skipping some more of the provocative terms. In a search for bears, which is a name for a subculture within a broader gay subculture that usually consists of heavy-set men with hairy bodies, the 10 most related tags are gay, gaddy, daddies, hairy, mature man, older, old, silver, and hirsute. The relationship between some of these tags probably seems, if not natural, at least familiar among many gay men areas of characteristic of bear. Other tags, however, create unexpected associations and wondrous juxtapositions, such as the relation between the national identity Japanese and worship, without the adjectival modification common to a syntactical relationship, resulting in some ambiguity as to the precise way in which these words interact to represent the social relation. Nevertheless, these arrangements effectively represent an index or diagram of the social structure and network in which these various representations of gender and sexuality occur. Furthermore, these tags to some extent allow for the corrective or supplement to X2's prescriptive categories, whereas the prescriptive category transsexual is too narrow and too specific a term for describing other transgender ways of being. Members often take it upon themselves to supplement that prescriptive category with tags such as transgender, transvestite, bisexual, crossdresser, femdom, dominatrix, woman, man, and queer. Tags that seek to refine, counteract, or complicate X2's prescriptive category and articulate a different social form. Many of these tags also reveal the way in which queer subcultures continue to reconstitute the nomenclature of the dominant culture, and we saw that with Chauncey and the term husband. And this happens for better or worse, and I'll apologize for some provocative terms here. Consider, for example, the use of troublingly sexist words such as slut, bitch, and pussy as they appear in relation to other tags such as humiliation, BDSM, and dominance. These words, often pejorative for women within the dominant culture, seem particularly unexpected in describing representations of sex between men. Perhaps like the word fag or queer, they function as reclaiming for offensive terminology. More likely, however, these categories of sexual being reveal that a highly gendered dynamic of power relations exists within the sexual relations between men. As such, queer social organization and self-understanding are deeply embedded in that of the larger culture by reproducing social forms of gendered heterosexuality and sexism. As I've shown, tagging within X2 reveals a highly developed and varied queer subculture that serves to structure social relations and self-understanding. These tags also develop under the weight of social disapprobation, either when members of X2 overtly intervene into the self-understanding of other members, or when the nomenclature necessary for effective retrieval and social organization stabilizes over time as socialization occurs and social conventions develop. Finally, these social relations always occur within and against a dominant culture. We see this in the way queer subcultures sometimes reproduce social forms of gendered heterosexuality, but also the way queer subcultural nomenclatures develop as a way to role play within the constraints of perceived boundaries of gender and sexuality. I'm going to skip a little bit. Do I have time for another minute? I have a minute. So right, it doesn't always develop top-down, bottom-up. It's horizontal. They don't necessarily then provide a purely emancipatory, there's a different kind of disciplining that's going on. I'm just going to go into a few future research things. Future research should examine specific development of various sexual nomenclatures within specific information institutions at various points in history. And this paper would have been more historical if it were longer. Such a project would help us continue to refine our understanding of the relationship between power, authority, and identity. It will also enable us to develop concepts in relation to existing theories, rather than merely applying or adapting theories from other disciplines. The Newport and X2 evidence indicates that we need to begin paying more attention to other social forms of sexual and gender nonconformity, other ways in which gender and sexual relations have been organized and understood, differentiated, named, and left deliberately unnamed. We need to specify the particularity of those modes of sexual being and the relationship between those modes and configurations of sexual identity as they develop within and against the dominant culture. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need to understand how organizing and structuring feelings of difference as part of the power to name helps people resist the social opprobrium and gives them the strength to publicly defy social convention. This paper provides a remarkable illustration of the extent to which gender and sexual boundaries are culturally constructed, and it reminds us that struggles over the demarcation of those boundaries are a central aspect of the study of gender and sexual knowledge organization. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We now have a few minutes for discussion, questions, and responses. As we did in the first morning session, I'll call, and I think we can hear each other. So I'll open up the floor for questions or comments. Melanie.
I have a question.
Okay.
What do you see as the role of the X2, not UX, X2 of administrators in terms of dominant culture? Because in a way they're kind of dominant culture within the subculture, but then they're not within the greater dominant culture.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, some of the tagging that I don't like the term users at all, so I'm not going to say that. But some of the tagging reveals a broader dominant culture that's not necessarily monolithic. So it's difficult to speak to what always constitutes a dominant culture, especially because it's always changing. There's like moments maybe we can pick out. And then the administrator's relationship to that dominant culture, I don't know, I suspect that a lot of the prescriptive categories they develop have more to do with how they see a mapping, they're trying to group things in ways that make sense to them. And some of that obviously is going to reflect the fact that they're part of a dominant culture, and some of that's going to reflect their own idiosyncrasies. So that's the best answer.
I know it's going to be hard for us to remember. We had three, right? We started with Anne, and then went through Zay and to Patrick. So we got to keep in mind that we had three participants.
I have a question for Anne. My current research interest is in epistemology and classification in the ancient Chinese culture. And over the years, I've had many methodological problems, and since your paper is on methodology, so I like to ask a question related to methodology. And actually the term epistemology is very problematic. When I conduct research on the Chinese culture, and I learned that, for example, the term knowledge itself did not exist in 2,000 years ago in China. Okay? So how do you study epistemology of China when knowledge, this concept did not exist in that time? So I had to, I read this from another person, an expert's work. So I said to myself, I know the Chinese classical literature, so I went back and think whether it's true, but it is true. I actually did a search in the entire collection of Confucius works, and knowledge is not normalized in the entire collection. So how do you study the indigenous knowledge if that concept is not defined in the same way as what we know in the Western culture, or whether it is different? And if it's different, then how do you overcome that barrier to study that concept in that culture, and how that affects how they organize knowledge?
I'm just going to stand up for you because I can't quite see you.
So,
you only can see me, not everybody can see you.
So when I approached it, from the indigenous palette of things that I could work with, I chose particular theorists, and I recognized that those are only one view of indigenous epistemology. So I just said, well, when I use this term indigenous theory or indigenous epistemology, it's quite specific because of the specific theorists that I'm using, and they're influenced by, in the 21st century, post-structural theory. So they're post-structuralist indigenous theorists. And if I wanted to, say, back up and use a language that's predominant, say, within indigenous education, where we use a language like, we don't use epistemology, we use ways of knowing, then I would go back and I'm doing knowledge translation, I'm doing philosophical language translation, I guess, and I would read as much as I could, just like you said, you're very familiar with your sources for the Chinese classics. Then I would just try to bridge my best understanding of, say, for example, ways of knowing in indigenous education to say, well, what is it that we're asking when we're looking at epistemology? What do we know? Who can be the knowers? And is there, in fact, a relationship to ontology? Because some ways of looking at epistemology want to split ontology and epistemology, and some ways want to collide them, like collapse them. So I don't have like an overarching approach. It would be very context specific, working with specific groups and documents or sources, because sometimes maybe in Indigenous scholarship, we might be looking at a document that is actually not a paper document, but it could be like monumental sculpture or something. It could be something, or knots in a string, that still is a way of carrying knowledge, of mapping knowledge, and of transmitting knowledge. So it's not a straightforward answer. Does that make sense to what you're thinking about for your area?
Yeah, I think that a very fundamental issue for me is that the ancient Chinese culture, knowledge itself is not a normalized concept. There is no term to describe it, right? So I'm thinking there may be a similar problem in indigenous cultures, right? And they probably call it something different. It may not be exactly the same concept. So what do they organize? You know, and so methodologically, so how do you decide how to look?
For Indigenous, we get that we get it a lot with the term art, because First Nations people will say, we don't have a term for the term, we don't have that term, we don't do art. But so they have this beautiful aesthetic, categories of aesthetic things. And sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I lost my thought on that.
So we can go back to other questions.
I have also a question for Anne. Sorry, Anne, to double question you. It's kind of similar to the question I asked John Eric before, so apologies for the second question, but you kind of brought it up as well, so I want to see your perspective on it. You mentioned that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in your methodology you were positioning. I want to know if, in your opinion, if you think that data collection is necessarily unethical in comparison to kind of other methodological approaches in terms of domain analysis. Because I'm wondering if we think about kind of Donna Haraway, I guess, argues that there can be such thing as better science, that in kind of a realistic or realist perspective, there can be better or worse or more ethical or less ethical ways of doing science. Because it seems that when people take up the domain analytic perspective, that oftentimes I mean, I love post-structuralism, and but there's this position against kind of science as the evil, unethical kind of way of doing things. And I don't know, do you agree with that, or do you think there can be more ethical science, or do you kind of say no to the data collection? Does that make sense to the question?
I'd like to come back to the data collection and just go back to Indigenous Métis-Sage, because there are implications that are attached to Métis-Sage as a methodology, and it has to do with typically like stuff coming from Donna Haraway and some of the feminists saying, you know, your research has to be transparent. You need to establish decision trails in your writing, in the accounts of what you call data. And I struggle with that, to say, should I call it data, or maybe it's just information? Because I'm not doing participatory research. I really am really engaging with the people who are generous enough to participate in the interviews and with the focus groups, as sort of trying to problem solve together. And I don't have a really good language for making that distinction between, as you're saying, I don't really view it as data collection in the traditional sense. Yeah. However, in my Indigenous supervisor, when I said, well, what I thought I would do would be study the literature without talking to any people, she said, I think not. That will not work. You need to talk to Aboriginal people, you need to talk to Aboriginal students and designers, and really, as the ethics of your research, that has to be there.
Yeah, that was kind of my roundabout point. That sometimes it seems that the voices are important to include, and that can be called data collection. So I see that you are including voices, and that was a very helpful answer.
What do you think about the term data collection? Is there something that you use instead?
I like your ways of knowing, and I think that there are different ways to capture that ways of knowing, and some of it involves looking purely at resources and text and so forth, as you mentioned, information planning and going in that direction. Some of it actually goes out and involves, statistics or interviews or different ways of doing things. So I think it's interesting that you brought up that you wonder about the use of data collections. I think that there could also be a better way of characterizing what that means to get at those different ways of knowing. So I'll have to think about that more myself as well.
Other questions? Go.
I have a question for Jay. In looking at different things that should be in the curriculum, there's sort of two general ways of going about it. You can either have a course on it, or you can integrate it throughout the curriculum. And the advantage, of course, of a course is that it's very visible. But if you integrate it, then everybody's going to get it for sure. Did you get any inkling from talking to people or looking at the curriculum?
You mean considering the surveys or my
Well, considering, I mean, how do you put ethics into the curriculum?
Yeah, in fact, a previous part of this research was analyzing in what moment of the curriculum were the contents on ethics. And it was curious because they were mostly in another area called fundamentals of information science, but mostly devoted to the ontological dimension, the code of ethics. No? But specifically in IO, I couldn't find any topic on this question. And it's strange because many professors are deeply concerned on IO procedures and the consequence of those procedures. And I think that this would be an important moment to insert the ethical discussion. And another situation that I noticed is that many professors are deeply interested in domain analysis, in considering the context in indexing. But curiously, there are no discussion on ethics in the curriculum.
Thank you.
Other questions? If I may, Patrick, ask a question. You talk about subcultures, and it makes sense to me in the historical environment that those names there were social roles, practices, performances, costumes even, if you want to call them that, so, the performance of attire as well as in activities. And you seamlessly use that same word in the XTube environment.
Yeah.
Do you think they're the same thing, or do you think that the technology changes the scope and reach of the word subculture in that particular
Well,
context?
definitely reconstitutes it. I guess I would say that performances very much still happen, and in some ways you could even diagram the extent to which somebody's a part of a particular subculture that gets performed, and that sort of forms around a similar fetishistic interest, right, online. And I mean, I wouldn't say they're all like clearly immutable or but obviously they transgress one into the other and spin out one into the other. But I do think it's possible to say, oh, there is a particular group of people who have formed sort of subculture around this particular fetish, interest, or whatever, and they regulate each other's self-understanding in order to be part of that group. So to the extent that that happens, I think you could say something to subculture.
Because the reason I ask is because it seems like there seems like a change in timescale in a way, or compartmentalization. And that given, I haven't read the historical study, but you would think that there was a longer period of performativity within the course of the day, for example, or the course of a week or months, if they're in the same social space. Whereas if there are videos being made, once the video's done, you can compartmentalize that and then move into another mode of being, another mode of performance.
Well,
So
you
there
can
seems
be
to be
part
a
of a lot
compartmental-
of different subcultures, yeah. I mean, you cannot just part of one subculture.
And it just seems historically the technology seems to allow that. in a little bit
I don't,
different way.
even historically, I'm not sure that, like, if we went, I mean, the reason we rely on Chauncey is, one, because that social organization is so radically different, right? So it provides the contrast, and doesn't map on well. So, but I guess what I would say is, even at that time, you could still potentially be a part of multiple subcultures. Even within just the Newport naval subcultural queer group, there were multiple subcultures.
Great. I can't wait to read the paper. It'll be great. All right, any other questions? Please.
It's not a question, it's just a building off that. So one thing our papers speak directly to each other, it's really funny. But I know Patrick, but I didn't know if they were that directly. Anyway, but I actually interviewed some people who tag transgender resources. And they talked, one of the interviews especially, talked about how she tags as performance. Like the act of naming resources was an act of performance. So
Yeah.
it definitely.
Even an activist, or I mean, there's like, what do they call them? Super taggers or something, right? Where they like, or tag bombing and all of that, yeah.
They're behaving more like social taggers than like trying to represent a particular community.
Yeah, yeah. Which, I mean, it's still a social dynamic. People still, it's a kind of overt intervention of some kind, whatever the objective, if there is an objective. I don't, they may not always
Be found no matter what. All right. Okay. I think we'll break now. So we'll come back together at 2:30. Sorry, 2:45. And we'll have the remaining presentations for today. So please enjoy the break and thank our speakers again for 3 wonderful presentations.